Welcome everyone to our first episode of Good Decks Built Wrong, the deck building series where I handicap good commanders with stupid decks, or give stupid commanders a much needed boost. With me, your host, the Wise Hoopo. For today's deck, I once heard someone describe Aristocrats as a black-based archetype, and I took exception to that. Leading the charge as a commander, Shalai and Halar. Now this pair is pretty powerful, so I'm going to get into how I lay down the vibe when I start building a deck. To start, here are some general lower bracket restrictions I like to stick to. Most of it has to do with making the deck easier to just hand to people I don't know and have them play it. Next, the goal is to make this an Aristocrats deck. Now, in a second, we're going to get into how we're really going to do that, but at this goal setting stage, this means that I don't want it to feel like any other Shalai counters deck. This is a fundamentally vibe call, but for me, I'm trying to make sure I can't win without a few when this creature dies triggers. This eliminates the usual infinites for Shalai, and a couple of other key cards that I'll bring up as we go. With those restrictions, and the jank nature of this strategy, I'm choosing to shoot for bracket 2 here. I think bracket 3 is fully possible if you used combos and tutors, but I stuck to bracket 2 because it gave me more room to explore these synergies as I first started thinking about them. Alright. I've teased it long enough. How are we doing Aristocrats in Naya? I have two base strats. The first one might have occurred to our audience members who played a lot of Innistrad Limited when I showed the commander. I have a straightforward option where mostly leveraging creatures like Lumbernut. These creatures get a counter whenever something dies, which Shalai then converts into damage, allowing us to create our own Blood Artist. Though these Blood Artists can't capitalize on board wipes. But as a token for this, we can use additional counters cards as additional triggers cards might normally be used. Additionally, several of these options allow us to put these counters wherever we please. This is going to be important for a lot of our later synergies, but for now it gives us a very potent commander threat as a side plan, especially since Shalai has native flying. For those of you who watched my gameplay video, you know I'm not exactly a big fan of Blood Artists, on account of the fact that counting to 100 is quite a daunting task. As previously said though, we have more ways to increase our damage than Black normally does, but we also have a second method for capitalizing on these triggers. For this, we're going to combine death triggers that make tokens, like Requiem Angel and Rayblade Trooper, with effects that add counters to those tokens, like Good Fortune Unicorn. While this seems like just another way to make one single sacrifice into one single damage, there's several knock-on effects that allow it to function as the centerpiece of the deck. Importantly, cards like Arwen and Bloodspore Thrynix, combined with the previous Blood Artists that allow us to put our counters wherever we please, create this positive feedback loop of damage. This is a good example of how we can manipulate the stack to generate more value. Since you control how triggers resolve, you can make it so that the trigger that adds counters to the Thrinax resolves before the triggers that make the tokens, thus allowing the tokens to receive all of the bonus counters that the Blood Artist effect put on the Thrinax, giving the deck the ability to rattle off a lethal 120 damage with relatively few creatures and giving it a much needed surprise factor. Here I want to draw additional attention to what will be a recurring theme in the video, the interweaving web of these strategies. To me, keeping plans interlaced is the key to making a deck feel like more than the sum of its parts. Here we can see how the death triggers give us more bodies to sacrifice to the Blood Artists, which get the counters we need to make tokens from the death triggers. And then on top of that, the counter adders put counters on the creatures to make more tokens for this whole loop. Additionally, some of these effects get to pull double duty. Thrinax is a sack outlet and a counter adder. Anafenza is a Blood Artist or a token maker. Priest of the Crossroads is a Blood Artist by itself, but also a counter adder for all the tokens we make. It's one big system. And while I'm very proud of that payoff machine, anyone who has built Aristocrats can tell you that that's only one of 3 pillars that the deck needs to function. Often the easiest one. It's only noteworthy because it's hard to find outside of Black. The other things that we need are sack outlets and enough tokens to kill our opponents. For our sack outlets, we've got some dumb tricks and then some weird options. For our dumb tricks, if people are playing Keep Away with Shalai, you could use Altar of Dementia to shift from a damage strategy to a mill strategy. It's not ideal, but with Priest of the Crossings, or Death's Presence, or just a really big Thrinax and Arwen, it is very doable. If we're in a pinch, I've already said you can use Thrinax as a sack option, but way more fun is using Mondrak's ability as a sack option, as long as you don't run out of life before your opponents do. Now, switching to our more typical options, we have both the altars, Goblin Bombardment, and the weird ones that I like are Fanatical Devotion and Martyr's Presence. Both of these are really fun to run out early on because you can make combat really squirrely and completely revolve around your own sack outlets. I will say from playing the deck, we could likely use a couple more, Greater Good comes to mind, but I do love the ones that I currently have. Finally, for our Aristocrats engine, we're going to need tokens. Our earlier payoff engine did make tokens, but those cards mostly just allow our existing creatures to count a little further. However, sometimes a deck like this just needs a big burst of tokens all at once. For that, we're doing it in a couple ways, most standard of which is Will of the Mardu, though it is a clever trick as a removal option for the other cards I'm about to present. These are the deck's final piece of the puzzle. Creatures that convert counters into tokens that we need to sacrifice. Not only do they function as our big token generators, but in a pinch, they get to be burn spells for our opponents. Now, this is one of those spots that the early restriction rears its head, since just slamming Boss's Chauffeur with an Arwen out and a decent board is something a normal Shalai deck is liable to do. In the end, I stuck with effects that had to do with death triggers. I felt that these were on this side of the line, and I cut the ones that had a habit of just winning outright on their own, even if these are some of my favorite cards. A big reason why I was so hesitant to cut all these effects is that they slot so nicely into that previously established web of effects. Now this is about to get complicated, but bear with me. If I have a hooded Hydra, I can boost the number of creatures it makes with a trigger from Arwen Weaver of Hope. Then I can equip a Blade of the Bloodchief onto that Arwen, so that when I stack my Hydra, I can put the counter on the Arwen, and then all the snakes get even more counters for even more damage. Then, if I can add a Valkyrie's Call into the mix, I can stack all the snakes in response to the return trigger on the Hydra, pumping up the Arwen even more, creating my own little Elenda the Dusk Rose when that snake comes back. I know, it's very complicated, but I like that about this deck. It makes it into this ever-morphing puzzle that you're trying to solve to drain out your opponents before they solve that puzzle and realize they're actually dead on board. It also feels very magical Christmas land, lining up all these effects for what amounts to a single Orzhov that is my girlfriend's commander. I agree that it is very difficult, and while the additional time afforded at a lower bracket helps, the deck still needs a well-integrated core of EDH vegetables to make such a convoluted engine work consistently. If you're interested in a more in-depth look into those EDH vegetables, or you're just enjoying my quirky deck building style, I recommend subscribing and checking out the channel. I normally talk about deck building and EDH mentality. Additionally, if you want to talk with me about your decks, come join the Discord and make some new friends. Finally, comment about your favorite off-color deck that you've been brewing, or just chewing on. And you can come check out my terrible color identity takes on Twitter or Blue Sky. To clarify for the uninitiated, vegetables in EDH refers to the things that you include in your deck just to keep it operating normally. This is usually interaction, ramp, and card advantage. As per Elk's most recent video, interaction is not just removal, but it's anything that interfaces with what your opponents are doing. So, protection, we have the aforementioned sack outlets that disrupt removal and combat as needed, and the normal inspiring call for a counters deck. For removal, we have a few targeted options and a couple wipes. Now, for wipes in the modern day, we're actually really spoiled for choice. I chose Blasphemous Act as it's cheap enough to immediately follow up with additional threats, and has a fun interaction that I can prevent the damage with Martyr's Cause, and then Damning Verdict, as obviously counters deck, but we also get even more reach than normal, since we get to capitalize on all of those death triggers with our surviving Blood Artists. Next, we get into our ramp package. In my video on the subject, I talk about how early ramp is usually characterized by the commander, but this deck doesn't really want its commander to be out and vulnerable early on, instead reserving it for right about to go off. Instead, our ramp choices are driven by our curve. For this deck, we have a really high spike at 3, so our small ramp we need to be mostly 1-drops. For our medium ramp, we're going to choose synergistic options, things like the altars and the horror specs. Finally, we're not going to really run large ramp, as our curve is really low, and our card advantage can't sustain 3+ spells for more than a single turn. Another wrinkle to the ramp package is our Aristocrats nature. This means that the deck heavily favors creatures, which does, consequently, go well with the 1-mana ramp, as most of it is creatures. Finally, we tried to integrate that ramp into the greater deck with sack outlets and cards like Twitching Doll, which can switch into the Chokin Generator role, or supportive parents that can leverage all of those tokens we make on our combo turn, as that's where we need our mana the most. Still, to critique myself a bit, I think this deck could use 2 more lands, 1 more 1-drop, and an Enduring Vitality for another medium ramp spell, if any of you are thinking of making your own version. Our last vegetable to eat is card advantage. Now, some of you may consider tokens, a form of card advantage, an evaluation of threats played to threats made. But such quibbles are for a separate video on card draw. For now, we're just going to focus on what this deck considers advantage. Now, we have cards that get advantages off of death triggers, as any Aristocrats needs. Additionally, we have ways to sacrifice cards to get advantage off of their power, which scales nicely with our 1/1 counters. Speaking of those counters, we have a few ways of directly translating them into the deck's strongest draw engines. Finally, we have a couple generic options just in case we're getting shut out from our normal game plan. A big thing I like to focus on with this deck is burst draw, even with my more engine-y cards being able to generate a lot of draw on my combo turn. I do this because a lot of winning with Aristocrats relies on surprise factor. So, draw like this allows us to more send it and hope for the best and reliably succeed, where the slow build-up of more typical engines is more likely to have you drawing attention before you're actually ready to win. If we look back at our web of effects one last time, we'll notice how each of these sections have shaped themselves around our base plan. Instead of our normal hyper-efficient white removal, we kept to options that triggered death, especially when it turned on our own creatures. Same with avoiding phasing for our protection effects. We want to keep those creatures seeing opposing deaths. For ramp, we slanted towards strong creature focus, completely avoiding a more typical land ramp package, as I can't sack lands when I go off. After all, we don't need our dorks anymore once we're winning the turn. Finally, most morphed is our card advantage, slotting into and capitalizing on every different aspect of our game plan. From the counters we stick on our newly minted tokens, to sacrificing our Alenda substitutes, to our jank burn payoff plan. As said at the top, all of this is an interweaving web. Every piece connected to the others to become something greater than its individual parts. It's not full combo, it's just the extreme of synergistic design. And after all, isn't that the epitome of Aristocrats? Creating an engine that synergizes so well it's indistinguishable from a combo deck and play pattern. I find piecing together wins with the deck incredibly fun while being generally straightforward enough not to get too fiddly. For the Rule Zeros combo for this deck, I usually call it Bracket 2, as it takes quite a bit to get together, and I describe it as Naya Aristocrats, making sure to point out when the first Blood Artist comes down. You might think this eliminates the fun of the surprise, but people respond so incredulously to the assertion that they will lose to a Rockslide Elemental that it makes it so much sweeter when you turn it around and kill them just the same. If this deck seems like your jam, the Mox Field's in the description, and I invite you to take it for a spin. The price tag might seem daunting, but I invite you to proxy, and even if you don't, most of the cost is in the mana base and the pretty cool printings. I'm excited to see what cool tech y'all discover from the list. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you sticking around to the end of the video. Make sure to share it with your friends if you found it fun, and come join our Discord to make some new friends. This is my first deck tech, so I hope that y'all had it fun and interesting. And next week we'll get back to the deck building stuff. We're going to go with how I conceptualize and choose the commander part of Commander. And bye.